I was struggling to find a way to talk about the Marvel set while remaining constructive. I think the correct response to something that you don't really feel like you can be constructive about is to just not really engage with it, mainly because when you do engage with things, you're giving them attention anyway, right? So positive or negative attention is still attention. But then Seth over at MTG Goldfish put out a video that was talking about why he feels like Final Fantasy works as a Universes Beyond set and Marvel doesn't. It's a great video. You should check it out. Link is in the description. His main argument in the video is basically that Magic creates worlds and not rosters of characters. And when you're focused on characters, you're sort of removing some of the agency that the player has in the world. And I agree. I think this is a good way to articulate it. But it got me thinking about why. Why does Magic traditionally, at least to those of us, I think, who have played for a long period of time, why do we feel like some of the Universe Beyond stuff works okay? I definitely could admit that something like Lord of the Rings makes a lot more sense, where something like Marvel really stands out as not fitting. So there's two things that I want to discuss that I think pertain to this feeling of some of the worlds working better than others. One comes from the book Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. This idea called closure. And the other is why J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of Lord of the Rings, hated Disney and did not want to work with them in any kind of animated adaptation of Lord of the Rings. So let's get into it.
Distraction makers.
So in his book, Understanding Comics, Scott McCloud attempts to define what makes comics different from other creative mediums. And he does this in a few ways. One is he defines comics as in like literally what is a comic? How do we decide if something is a comic or isn't a comic? And his definition is juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information and or to produce an aesthetic response in the viewer, which I think is just a fancy way of saying putting images together in sequence to tell a story. That story doesn't necessarily have to be a narrative one. It could just be how images sort of connect together to, like he says, evoke an aesthetic response. Or why are these two images together and what is the relationship between them? The other one is the spectrum between photorealism and iconic or abstract, and how the closer we get to photorealism, the more defined a character is as an individual, and the more abstract we get, the more people can see themselves in that character. But the final important thing, and I think what pertains to our conversation today, is the idea of closure. So when Scott McCloud discusses closure as a concept, he's actually borrowing from Gestalt psychology, which is a theory of perception that emphasizes the processing of entire patterns and configurations and not merely individual components. There are actually quite a few different Gestalt laws. The law of closure states that we perceive elements as belonging to the same group if they seem to complete some entity. Our brains often ignore contradictory information and fill in the gaps. Scott McCloud says about the idea of closure that all of us perceive the world as a whole through experience of our senses, yet our senses can only reveal a world that is fragmented and incomplete. This phenomenon of observing the parts but perceiving the whole is called closure. Some forms of closure are deliberate intentions of storytellers to produce suspense or to challenge audiences. And comic panels fracture both time and space, offering a jagged staccato rhythm of unconnected moments. But closure allows us to connect these moments and mentally construct a continuous, unified reality. And through this idea of closure, you're placing two images together and then asking the viewer to make a connection between the two things. And so this sort of brings us back to Magic and Universes Beyond, and I think why a number of players have this issue with Universes Beyond. And it's that it interrupts this idea of closure, this idea of being able to connect the dots between cards to build a world perspective in your mind. Oftentimes, especially with card games, I think about this sort of sequential art part of it, right? Where you are putting game pieces into play that have art on them, and that art is loose enough that you can connect the dots between them and sort of tell a story. And the game Sorcery is phenomenal at this. That's, I think, its strongest design goal, I think, is to evoke what early Magic felt like, which was, I think, your ability to tell a story through this card game. Through playing these cards, you are in effect telling the story of what is happening. I don't think every player is bothered by this, obviously. Some players are like, well, these are just game pieces. They're, rules text. But I do think there's a line for every player in terms of what would be acceptable. I just think each of us draw this line in a different place. In terms of like what's important to us about how we feel when we're playing the game. But for me, a lot of the Universes Beyond stuff is things that I don't necessarily want to be thinking about when I'm playing a game of Magic. This shift for Magic has been happening for a long time. I think it's much earlier than Universes Beyond, where you could in some ways feel them attempting to create iconic characters to use for marketing. And the primary example is Planeswalkers, where I think you could argue that they were detrimental to the design of Magic, maybe not in like as big of a way as some of the stuff that's happening today. And because Wizards' focus with Planeswalkers was so much on creating these iconic characters, we ended up sort of pushing the bounds multiple times of the power bounds of the formats that they were printed in with, originally Jace the Mind Sculptor and later Oko. But I do think, ironically, Commander ended up being part of what opened up this character marketing idea for Magic, where they tried to manufacture it with Planeswalkers, and it worked okay, right? Like, a lot of people do associate Jace, Liliana, Chandra, those characters with Magic the Gathering. I don't think it ever quite landed in the way that they wanted it to, in terms of like something like akin to Marvel superheroes that are iconic characters that people identify with and represent specific things and can be used for marketing purposes. I'm not necessarily saying like Commander is the reason why we have Universes Beyond. I think this could have happened anyway, but I do think the idea of an iconic character that leads your deck is part of what has paved the way to Magic being able to use iconic characters to help represent the game. After thinking of all this stuff, this idea of closure and how important I think it is for some players, me being one of them. If I am playing in a format that has Universes Beyond, inevitably I will see these characters, right? Other players get to have agency in that situation. I don't necessarily get to tell them directly, hey, you can't play Universes Beyond. All that being said, I think the question still remains as to like why? Like, why would Magic want to go in this direction at all, right? If Magic's worlds were something that made the game so special and unique, why would they abandon that and aim towards iconic characters? And this is where we get into our discussion about Tolkien and Disney. There's a series of published letters that Tolkien wrote just to various business partners. Letter 13 is where Tolkien basically voices his loathing, I guess, for Disney. In the published letters, letter 13, Tolkien was responding to one of his publishers, Allen and Unwin. He was responding to an inquiry from them about American publishers' interest in The Hobbit, to which he responded by asking the name of the American publishers and inquired about the financial arrangements. And he responded to their request for additional illustrations that he agreed that he ought to draw them. Tolkien being a professor at the time, he would not have time to do the illustrations himself. He instructed Allen and Unwin to allow the American firm to produce their own illustrations rather than lose their interest through delay, with the proviso that it must be possible to veto anything from or influenced by Disney Studios. For all those works, I have a heartfelt loathing. In other letters that Tolkien had written, we see that he kind of has like a respect for Disney, but also a loathing about what they're doing. I think he sees the artistry in Disney, but his biggest issue with them was that they were trivializing what he held in such high regard, which was fairy tales. He acknowledged the artistry in the surface of Disney's work. He loathed the dumbing down of fairy tales to make them more marketable and Disney's focus on how this work could make money. And the end result of sanitizing is that these stories become simple, condescending, one-dimensional children's fare. Tolkien felt Disney trivialized the very genre and mythical species, dwarves in particular, he was trying to legitimize through Lord of the Rings. Disney obviously is one of the most successful storytellers of the modern era. Their sort of concepts of how to attract people to their products has become pervasive in basically every genre of media, right? They make things as approachable as possible, to sanitize them, to make them sort of devoid of things that, of anything that could possibly make somebody not want to engage with the media. These two things I think are in conflict in a way that Tolkien was basically describing, is that it seems very difficult to have a story that both communicates to as wide of an audience as possible and one that is one of profound, deep meaning for some types of subject matters. It's weird, right? Because like The Lord of the Rings movies themselves are incredibly beloved by, millions and millions of people, and they did not do much to sanitize what Tolkien was doing. However, on the flip side of things, some companies like Disney and Marvel, there is this direction towards how do we simplify this content to make sure that as wide of an audience can understand it as possible. And I do think that we have seen that trend start to emerge in Magic when I've talked in previous videos about the gameplay itself even becoming somewhat one-dimensional. Gameplay that is less confrontational towards your opponents and a focus on your own resource accumulation. But I think so much of this comes down to this ability to market a specific character, to package something that can be easily exported and imported into other media. We sort of lose something, right? We lose something in the idea of closure being replaced by iconic characters that are static, right? And our ability, our agency as players to tell those stories for ourselves in our own minds, I think sort of erodes, right? And instead, we're sort of just retelling these stories of these iconic characters as we know them, right? Like Wolverine is always Wolverine. Even in Final Fantasy, Cloud is always Cloud, right? Like these characters are iconic, right? They have baggage. They come with what they have been defined as before. Final Fantasy, I think, works because there are sort of all these other things in the world. There are chocobos and cactars, and the world must be filled out because you as a player get to explore it through the games, where with something like Marvel, the world is more of a backdrop just for the characters themselves. And I think that's where things struggle to be translated into a game in which us as players, we are supposed to sort of experience the world firsthand. To me, it's more of like a subconscious thing, if I'm playing in a tournament environment, I'm not necessarily all that concerned with the story that the game is telling or whatever. It's just more about something coming up in the game that kind of makes me go ugh, it just takes you out of it for some reason. It's the verisimilitude. It's this immersion that's broken for a moment, and then you're just sort of back into it. And when that keeps happening, it feels like it becomes kind of impossible to ignore for me. After watching Seth's video and kind of thinking about I do think Final Fantasy and Lord of the Rings works better than Marvel for Universes Beyond to exist within Magic the Gathering, and trying to wrap my head around why. I think Closure, by the concept by Scott McCloud, Closure is really the thing for me that was the aha moment. I was like, yes, that I think is what it is. It's my ability to feel like all of this stuff can fit together into the same world. And I don't think it's just that the settings are not as fleshed out, or that it's because it's a setting that is outside of what Magic settings would usually be. I think something like Warhammer was fine. I even think Edge of Eternity, right? Edge of Eternities was fine and felt like it was Magic enough. Even though I do think that they're trying to broaden the spectrum of what's acceptable in the Magic space, things that we would consider to be Magic the Gathering. But so much of this comes back to Tolkien's issues with Disney, and this feeling of we are taking something that had profound meaning, that was deep, and was not about just the money, right? It was about the experience. It was about the lessons that we learned from the game system, from the settings, the stories that were being told, and our place as players within those worlds. And it's being sort of shifted to focus more on these iconic characters that you can sort of put in a little box and import them into whatever piece of media they would fit into. And those characters are static and unchanging, and removing a sense of agency for the player to define that part of the story for themselves. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd be curious to hear what you think. Make sure you like and subscribe to the channel if you want to continue the conversation. You can join the Discord. The link is in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.